For this message as we continue our series, Inside and Outside, Congruence in the Life of Joseph. We started this series in December, and we're continuing it into this new year on the Gregorian calendar. We have so many New Years in a Messianic congregation because we had New Year for Rosh Hashanah. Now this is the other New Year, and they're just excuses to celebrate. So celebrate, have fun. But we continue our conversation on congruence. And the idea of congruence throughout this series is the dictionary definition: in agreement or harmony with each other. In geometry, it's figures that are identical in form, coinciding exactly when superimposed. And we've asked the questions throughout this series. Does your inside match your outside? Do you see yourself the way God sees you? Do you live like God is for you? Eugene Peterson, which embarrassingly, his first name was misspelled in the first few messages, is now spelled correctly. And he said, the Christian life is a lifelong practice of attending to the details of congruence between ends and means, congruence between what we do and the way we do it, congruence between what is written in Scripture and our living out what is written, congruence between a ship and its prow, congruence between preaching and living, congruence between the sermon and what is lived in both preacher and congregation. The congruence of the Word made flesh in Jesus with what is lived in our flesh. So in this series, we're talking about congruence, and what that means for us in simple terms is what we believe should equal how we live. Now, Joseph in Genesis is this amazing story of congruence that begins with pain at 17, and it doesn't get healed until 37. He's a prototype for our Messiah, Yeshua, and he learns over 20 years how to make his inside and his outside match. But the problem we've talked about throughout this series is revelation equals new information, and a transformation is changed based on that information. But there's a gap between revelation and transformation, and for Joseph, it's 20 years, and for us, it always takes longer than we want it to take. And we get revelations and we experience some transformation throughout the process, but it's also frustrating as we go through because it doesn't seem like we are getting the transformation that we hoped for, which is why we're continuing the series today with a message titled, It's Not Just About You. It is about you. It's just not just about you. One of the issues in our culture and in our world is the idea between instant gratification versus delayed gratification. Instant gratification, what you get right away. Delayed gratification, when you wait for it. And as someone with ADHD who's hyperactive, it is very difficult to understand delayed gratification because my spontaneity tells me I want what I want right now and I don't want to feel what I feel. When I was 17, actually this was me, at 17, similar shirt. Yes, my favorite band, Lamb. And I felt called to ministry at 17. I knew that God had called me to be a rabbi. And growing up Jewish, but also in a Pentecostal expression, I would have people pray over me and prophesy over me, and they'd say things like, you're going to preach to thousands, you're going to preach to kings and to emperors. And even then, I thought, are there even any emperors in this world to preach to anymore? But I also fully expected those things to happen, like every year since I was 17. I'm 42, and every year I expect these things to happen. And a few years ago, when I started meeting with my friend and mentor, Pastor Brad Barshaw, he said this to me: what if preaching to thousands means you preach to a congregation of 100 people, and over time you will have preached to thousands? And when he first said that to me, I said, but that's not what I want. And the difficulty is we confuse our interpretation of God's promises with God's actual promises. We hold him to the expectation of how he's going to fulfill promises, and we get mad at him because he hasn't done it yet. But did he actually say what you're holding him to? Because all he said to me was, you're going to preach to thousands. And over 20 years, well, this January is now the 18th year of preaching and teaching and in ministry. And, well, I've actually already preached to thousands, not just in the congregations that I've led, but at conferences and at big churches, and I have done. I just couldn't see it because I had an expectation of what that meant, that my congregation had to be thousands. And I said to God all the time things, and this is the struggle because, I found out, well, it's not just about me, as it's not just about you. Are God's promises that you've been holding on to what he actually said? See, God's interest is doing what we said in the last message, which if you haven't caught up in this series, I encourage you to go back. The message from a few weeks ago was don't forget and be fruitful. And we have to remember what I said then, which is your calling from God is not a spectacular ministry or whatever you would fill that blank in with, but to a faithful and sincere heart. And in the story of Joseph, success is found in having a faithful and sincere heart. That's true for us. That's true for Joseph, because Joseph knew his success came from the Lord, and he was fruitful because God was with him. John Maxwell says it this way: we overestimate the event, we underestimate the process. We microwave instead of crockpot. But the goal is legacy, not the moment. And that's why instant gratification is a microwave. Delayed gratification is a crockpot. Now you can make something hot and tasty, but it will be much better if it's done in a crock pot and simmers for a long time than if you run it for 2 minutes. Or as Jim Gaffigan says, hot pockets or diarrhea pockets, right? Like you can have something quick, but the instant gratification might cause delays and other things that shouldn't be delayed. But delayed gratification is so much more fulfilling. And the story of Joseph reminds us, is a great reminder to us, that it's not just about you. And that is clearly demonstrated when Joseph's brothers arrive right at his throne step. That 20 years after they sold him into slavery, and he naming his son, God will help me forget all of my father's family, that suddenly, after 7 years of prosperity and him leading Egypt and saving the whole world, his brothers show up asking for food. And he sees them and he knows who they are, but they can't tell who he is because he looks like, it's my favorite joke every time. He looks like an Egyptian, he walks like an Egyptian, he talks like an Egyptian. It says in Genesis 42 and verse 6, now Joseph was the ruler over the land, and he was the provider of grain for all the people of the earth. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him, faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he made himself unrecognizable to them. And then he spoke harshly to them. And he said, but first, we have to pause and realize he recognizes his brothers because they look like who they are, and they're still Hebrews, and they're dressed like shepherds. But he's an Egyptian, and they don't know who he is. As far as they're concerned, he is an Egyptian who worships pagan gods. They know nothing. In fact, and the scriptures tell us, we're going to find in these chapters, that he actually speaks through an interpreter. So they speak Hebrew to someone who speaks Hebrew, and the Hebrew interpreter translates into Egyptian, which is like chair, flower. No, I'm just kidding. It's not hieroglyphics. It's he interprets into Egyptian and then back through his interpreter to Hebrew. So they have no idea. And it's got to be a scary moment because this leader of the free world, who's responsible now to save everyone and there's no food anywhere, speaks harshly to them and says, where have you come from? From the land of Canaan, they said, to buy grain as food. And it says, again in verse 8, though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then watch this. Then Joseph remembered the dreams. Remember, he tried to forget. He named his son Forget. And in all of his fruitfulness and the success that God had seen him through in these last 20 years, suddenly the dreams come back because what he dreamt and told his brothers at 17 had now come true, even in the face of all the adversity that he had been through for these 20 years. And he remembers his dream, and that makes him angry. It's why he speaks harshly to them. Because what those jerks did to them, he now has the power to repay. I've got the power! Dun, 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 dun. Right? That's the moment that Joseph can have. And so he says to them, you spies, you've come to see the undefended places in the land. And the brothers say, no, my lord. They said to him, your servants just came to buy grain as food. And look, we're all sons of one man, and we're honest. Your servants have never been spies. I mean, just as a human being, what would your reaction be? You think you're honest men? Do you even remember what you did to me? That wasn't Joseph's experience. They weren't honest at all. They threw him in a pit. They buried him in an empty cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites, to slavery. They sent him to Egypt, where he still prospered, but then ended up in prison. And then these two had dreams, and then he interpreted the dreams. And all through it, the scripture says, and Joseph, we talked about it last time, Joseph knew that Adonai was with him, and he prospered everything he did, but Joseph was trying to forget things he shouldn't forget, because here it is, right in front of his face, his brothers who destroyed his life. And Joseph has an opportunity, as we have an opportunity. And this is the question in this message, that it's not just about you, is do you want to make a point, or do you want to make a difference? See, making a point is easy. And making points will get you angry followers. Making a difference is harder. Making a difference will get you attacked by angry people. But the brothers speak then in response to Joseph's question. They speak among themselves. The scripture says among themselves in Hebrew to each other, not realizing that he understands them. And each man said to his brother, this has got to be it, guys. We're truly guilty for our brother. Joseph's listening to their words. We saw the distress in his soul. He begged us for mercy, and we didn't listen. That's why this distress has come to us. And Reuben answered and said to them, didn't I tell you don't sin against the boy? Which he did. He said, let's not kill him, let's sell him. All right, well, it's not that great. But you didn't listen. Now you see his blood is now being accounted for. How many times have you thought to yourself, this is happening to me because it's payback time. Must be karma. What goes around comes around. We think to ourselves, I'm getting, when we suffer and something bad happens, there's a part of us that thinks, well, this is probably what I deserve. But that's not how God treats his people. And Jewish people and Gentile Christians do not believe in karma. We do not believe that God is going to pay us back for the things we've done. That's not what grace and mercy is. And it says they did not know that Joseph was listening, since there was an interpreter between them. And in that moment, he turned away from them and he wept. When he turned back to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon. I love the words "and wept," because I think he's crying for himself and all the pain he went through. But he's also has to be astonished that his brothers are connecting, that have been walking with the guilt and the shame and the pain of what they did to their brother for all 20 years. And there's this moment when he turns, and even he's still trying to figure out the gap, right, between revelation and transformation. And it says, and he took Simeon from them and tied him up before their eyes. See, he understood. He weeps with his brothers, for himself and for his brothers. But then he also continues with his plan, because the transformation hasn't taken place yet. And Joseph was determined to make a point. You will never hurt me or anyone else again. And you've met these guys in real life. I see them on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, like every day. I posted a thing for the holidays, like the end of the year. If you're looking for a holiday gift, you should buy my book, Jesus Never Said Anything New. And somebody I don't know commented, yes, he did. Read Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. First of all, who are you? Second of all, I have a chapter on Matthew 5 in the book. Third of all, do you really think just from a pithy response to a title that you reacted to, that all of a sudden I'm going to go, oh man, I should have thought about Matthew 5, which I did because I wrote a whole chapter on it in the book. But people just want to make a point. And they're making random points to random people. And not just people. I mean, I lived like this for a long time because I was trying to prove myself. And I wanted to prove myself to people who wouldn't see me. And in trying to do that, I did all kinds of things that I regret. So here's the question. Do you want to make a point? Or do you want to make a difference? See, Joseph wants to make a difference, but in his anger, he's making a point, and he sends them all over the known world. You can read the whole story for yourself, the narrative in Genesis, the end of Genesis. He tricks them several times, and near the end, all he wants is his younger brother, Benjamin, who wasn't there, and his plan worked to keep his little brother and to get rid of these other jerks. And then Judah, the oldest, speaks up and ruins Joseph's plan. He says in verse 30 of Genesis 44, if I go to your servant, my father, which, by the way, in this short speech, Judah says my father 4 times. He says our father once. And you have to imagine that Joseph hasn't seen his father for 20 years. Part of him is wondering, is my father still alive? Which he says after this. But his brother Judah, who threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery, is now afraid that Benjamin is going to be taken and can't handle the guilt of what that would do. So he says, if I come to my servant, my father, and the boy isn't with us, you don't understand. His life is bound to my brother's life. And when he sees that the boy is no more, he will die. Then your servant will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief. For your servant became pledge for the boy, with my father, saying, if I don't bring him back, I will bear the blame before my father all my days. So please, and this is crazy, because there has to be hope. Like Joseph would have wanted Judah to say this about him 20 years earlier. And he's determined to think that there's been no change in Judah's life either. I'm going to give them what they deserve. But Judah says, so please let your servant remain as my Lord's slave in the boy's place, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father and the boy is not with me, else I must see the evil that would come upon my father. See, Joseph was determined to make a point. He could have kept Benjamin. He could have sent his brothers away and let them die in the famine and not feed them. And in some minds, he would have been right to do so. But instead, he chose to make a difference. How about you? Do you want to make a point? Or do you want to make a difference? It's hard. And Joseph responds, and he says to his brother, now Joseph could no longer restrain himself in front of all those who were standing with him, so he cried out, get everyone away from me, in Egyptian. So no one stood with Joseph when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. But he gave voice to weeping, so that the Egyptians heard and all of Pharaoh's household heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, and this is the craziest moment, because all of a sudden, this guy who looks like an Egyptian and talks like an Egyptian and is Egyptian and has been speaking through an interpreter, all of a sudden in Hebrew says, Ani Yosef. Can you imagine the fear? First, he understands us. Second, what? I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And of course, it says, and his brothers were unable to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Why? I mean, the shock and awe of the moment. He Wait, we were worried he was going to kill us. He sent us all over the world. We just brought our brother back, and we've been talking in Hebrew about Joseph this entire time, and apparently you're saying you are Joseph, which, by the way, just as a side note, Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. And I think the reason why he says, please come near to me is, and this is just my own interpretation of the text, I think he shows them his circumcision. Because Egyptians weren't circumcised in the same way. And he says, come near to me. And he says, I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold to Egypt. What? So now, and this is where he shifts. So now don't be grieved. And don't be angry in your own eyes that you sold me here, since it was for preserving life that God sent me here before you. Now I get it. Oh, I just saved my whole family from famine. I just saved the whole world from famine. I don't think Joseph's saying this in confidence. I think he's saying, guys, look, oh no. Well, I've been faithful and sincere through this whole time, but I tried to forget what God didn't want me to forget. And now we're standing here and I'm determined to kill all of you because that's what you did to me. But now I realize what this was really all about. For 2 years of famine in the land, there's been 2 years of famine, and there will be 5 more, yet with no plowing or harvesting. But God sent me ahead of you to ensure a remnant in the land and to keep you alive for a great escape. So now it wasn't you. You didn't send me here, but God. And he made me as a father to Pharaoh, Lord over his whole house. This is why we don't believe in karma, by the way. And it doesn't mean that you can say to people, well, there's a reason for all of these things happening to you. There doesn't have to be a reason that makes sense to us, because if we said throughout this whole series, the secret things belong to God. We don't always get answers as to why things are happening. But what we know is if God is with us and everything we do succeeds, and we have faithful and sincere hearts in the things that we're doing, then God never leaves us or forsakes us. And if he never leaves us or forsakes us, and he wants to pour out his blessing on us, then Joseph finishes I ruled the whole world. It's not just about you. Friends, it's time to get over yourself. It's not just about you anyway. And the one who made you and formed you in your mother's womb has been working in your life through the suffering and through the pain that you're trying to avoid, we talked about last time. That as you deal with it, God deals with you, and in dealing with your trauma and naming these things, and understanding what they are, it starts to fade. Okay, maybe it wasn't everybody else's issue, and maybe bad things just happen because bad things happen, but if God is with me, even in the bad things, then certainly he'll be with me in the good things. And I know so many of you are going through difficult things, and I know you're carrying heavy burdens throughout this end of this pandemic, whenever the heck it will actually end. And I know you're getting the Shechem kicked out of you all the time. But it's time to stop making points and instead make a difference. Because you have no idea what God is doing. We don't know what comes next. And that is a good thing. Because we have to trust that the Lord has a good plan for you and that his plan will work out even if you never get an answer to why. So we ask, how can I make a difference? How can we make a difference in our marriage and with our children and at work and at school and in every relationship we have? And this is how you can make a difference. First, you have to change your perspective. God is not against you. God is for you. God is not punishing me. God is blessing me. It's a shift of perspective. It doesn't mean you run away from the problems. It doesn't mean you don't acknowledge them. We acknowledge that there are hard things happening and painful things that we will probably never get an answer to. But if you can shift your perspective from God is against me to God is for me, then you're going to be okay because God has done it before. So you change your perspective. The second is you do the work on your past. This is where counseling is super important and has been, I've well documented over the last several months. I've been counseling for 2.5 years, and all of these things are starting to come out. I'm moving into a place of understanding what God has actually asked me to do. And it's very different. Well, it's actually not that different. I just misinterpreted what he said. And I've been holding him to things that he never actually promised. You're going to preach to thousands. Well, I'm 42 years old and I already have. So what am I waiting for? Well, I just want to be faithful and sincere to the things God has called me to do. And so we have to do the work on your past. You can't just ignore it. You can't pretend there's no worries and no regrets. We talked about last time. You got to be in community somewhere. For those of you who are watching online, I'm so glad you can connect with us, but you have to live life with other people who understand that you have to work on your past and not just try to forget it. Another way we can make a difference is you stop blaming everyone else. They did the best they could with what they had. I know it's hard to receive it, but it's true. And I know some of you have been through incredibly painful things, but the truth is the people who hurt you also had their own trauma that they never dealt with. And you have an opportunity as a follower of Yeshua to stop blaming everybody else, because it's not just about you, but also recognize that God is trying to do something in you that has nothing to do with them, but everything to do with what God has called you to. And they don't need to understand. The people who hurt you don't need to understand for you to be healed. The last way you can make a difference is let God heal your trauma. You can't heal something that you don't call what it is. You have to be able, in the process of counseling, to find what trauma you actually experience. And we all have experienced trauma in our life. It's not in comparison to other people's story. It doesn't mean that the people who hurt us are bad people. And maybe some of them are. But you won't heal until you name it. And you gotta let God heal your trauma. And this is what's incredible about this whole process, is then, in making a difference for yourself through those things, then you can help others. How can I make a difference? I'll tell you. You can help them change their perspective, because these narratives that they're running on aren't true either. You can help them do the work on their past and encourage them to go into counseling and be in community because you found healing in those things. You can help them stop blaming everyone else and face their own stuff. And you can help them let God heal their trauma. Making a point is easy. Making a point will get you angry followers. Making a difference is hard. Making a difference will get you attacked by angry people. But after all, this is the difference between instant gratification and delayed gratification. Making a point is the microwave way. Making a difference is the long crockpot way. The goal is legacy, not the moment that you're finding yourself in. Because after all, it's not just about you. Next week, we're going to continue this series, Inside and Outside, Congruence in the Life of Joseph, because I just am building you up these last few weeks, and next week I got to tear you down. So you don't want to miss the next series. It's a message just called Because You're Dumb. Because you are dumb. And so am I. But thank God that in his grace and mercy, he doesn't give us what we deserve or give us blessing based on our intelligence. He knows we're like sheep walking around in the wilderness, and he keeps saying, the entrance is over here, and we're like, I'll keep circling. But the more you can face your stuff, the more you will find congruence and match the inside with your outside. So if you can be with us in person, we would love to see you in Seattle. If you can't, we encourage you to watch the next message in this series, Because You're Dumb, on the Restoration app, Facebook, YouTube, however you connect with us. We're so glad that you're here with us. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.